test audit, or is roles and responsibilities of an Agile tester. I'm joined here with our head of our Agile practice, Dave Sufrinko. Dave is a certified Scrum Master, Agile Coach, and ISTQB Quality Assurance and Test Engineer. He's been working in IT management for over 30 years and has designed and implemented multiple testing centers of excellence for Fortune 500 companies. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a quick reminder before I turn it over to Dave, if you have any questions or comments, there is a box on the control panel for questions. You can just type them in there, and I will address them. If I feel fit, I'll address them with Dave as we run through this. Otherwise, we'll just wait till the end and address them all at the end. Dave, go ahead and take it from here.
All right, Brian, thanks. Again, good afternoon, and thanks for attending the webinar on roles and responsibilities of an Agile tester. As Brian mentioned, I am the practice leader for our testing practice as well as the Agile practice. Again, 30 years experience of all facets of QA, and really for the past 12, out of necessity, I ventured into the Agile arena. During the past year or so, I visited, again, many companies and clients concerning testing capabilities. And again, more than often, the topic of Agile and Agile testing has come to the forefront. And as you know, there are many flavors of Agile and Agile implementation, really based upon the FTE experiences with Agile, whether they have formal training, informal training, or just reading and they go ahead and implement Agile. And again, also organizationally, companies are structured in many different ways. Again, some conducive and some not so conducive to an Agile development methodology. However, one common theme always seems to rotate around the Agile testing. Again, companies are not realizing all the benefits or expectations garnered from implementing Agile. So the approach to this webinar is really to compare and outline the roles and responsibilities of an Agile tester to that of a traditional or waterfall tester. So very quickly, agenda, as a quick overview of traditional versus an Agile approach, the actual roles and responsibilities of an Agile tester, testing an Agile development lifecycle, and then again, really addressing some of the issues and common themes, and of course, role transformation. Again, this is typically what you'll find out on the internet or when you're doing some research on Agile, and they do the comparison between Agile testing, traditional versus an Agile approach. And you can see the criteria to understand the requirements, planning, test cases, managing change, progress, review, and quality. And of course, traditional, upfront, plan one delivery, which happens to happen way later. Again, designing test cases upfront, change control, etc. And then they try to preface it with the Agile, again, constant interaction with the product owner, creating the test strategy in the initiation phase or sprint zero. Of course, designing the test cases sprint by sprint, and then adapt and adjust, work with software at each release, and then the entire team, which is overall responsible from a QA perspective. So I took this and breaking it down, each one of those areas. First, understanding requirements up front, where it's in a traditional waterfall, we'll get a 100-page Word doc or specifications, and we try to understand those requirements as you down the SDLC. And then in Agile, they're saying, constant interaction with the team and with the product owner. So from the perspective of a QA tester, and I preface that with a non-Agile, the constant interaction with business analysts, clients of business, and program managers. Again, you can couple all of those into the product owner. So the product owner is the role that really comes up with the project. He owns the project. He sets the deadlines. He sets the feature set. From a non-Agile approach, testers typically, and I say typically, they act with the business analyst, the line of business, or program managers to perform the same function. So if you substitute the word product owner for the business analyst, line of business, or program manager, you're essentially doing the same thing in a waterfall or a traditional. Understanding requirements, we can substitute the word requirements for user stories. So requirements, no matter in what form they are in from a waterfall approach in Agile, those requirements are user stories. Again, from a traditional, they ensure 100% testable and measurable. I mean, that's their role. Expected results, we need to understand, to ensure that they are testable and measurable, we need to understand the business roles, the data requirements, the permutations, positive and negative test cases, and so on, to ensure that before we sign off on a particular document from a PMI perspective or a waterfall perspective, we need that information for the quality assurance or test engineer to validate the requirements are testable and measurable. In Agile, that is known as the acceptance criteria. So again, this thing does, Agile does say this is a shared responsibility. So when in traditional upfront, the QA group or the QA engineer takes on those responsibilities. In Agile, it's shared. So understanding requirements will also involve the PO, the BA, the development, etc. But from a perspective of the QA, that is their responsibility, whether it's shared or not. So when we understand requirements, traditional upfront or Agile constant interactions with the team and the product owner, if you do a comparison side by side, there is no difference between the role and responsibility of an Agile tester, whether you are operating in an Agile development methodology or a traditional upfront or waterfall methodology. We move on to planning. Again, traditional planning project delivery sometime in the future. It could be 6 months out, a year out, 18, 2 years out. It really doesn't matter. In Agile, you create the test strategy during Sprint Zero. Again, Sprint Zero, for those unaware, is where all the preparations need to take place, such as setting up your test environment, your test strategy, and tools. All that stuff happens. Every task that's required prior to the actual development is done in Sprint Zero. And of course, from a planning perspective, it's continuous sprint planning, so sprint by sprint, we'll continue to plan along the way. That is the primary difference. However, from a non-Agile, their typical roles include creating the test strategy and master test plan. They may or may not create a data management plan, an environment management plan. Again, if they have an automation strategy, they're going to create that along with tools, coding standards, naming conventions, and they may even do process modeling and wireframe. So these are all the things that are done from a planning perspective of a non-Agile QA. And again, all tasks required to support the project or application under test prior to test execution. These are now Sprint Zero activities. So again, if you break down a traditional versus Agile, the role of the tester, again, there is no difference on what he or she is required to do from an Agile standpoint to a traditional. Third thing from an Agile, again, designing the test cases. Traditionally, you do them up front. Again, that is correct. We create the test plans and create the test cases as developers are doing their coding and design. And essentially, at one particular time in this phase, we will get that code and we will execute the test cases. From an Agile, it's evolving and we're producing the test cases per sprint. So if we do a comparison again, a non-Agile tester is build and design and create the test cases from a manual perspective. They're going to plan for 100% test case coverage, create the test data, create a test execution plan. They will create the requirements traceability matrix. They may focus on end-to-end processing. So again, this whole thing of designing test cases is really centered around verifying and validating the system works as designed according to the functional and non-functional requirements specifications, which we've learned a few slides earlier. The requirements are now user stories, and determine whether they meet expectations or functional, non-functional specifications, now referred to as acceptance criteria. So again, from a QA perspective, the roles and responsibilities in Agile or Waterfront, there is no distinction between their roles and responsibilities. Manage change control process. That's typical in a waterfall as we go along. Again, could be 6 months, a year out. Things tend to change, requirements change, and there is a standard way of managing that change. In Agile, we adapt and adjust by release and by sprint. So if you look at the processes, either or, from a waterfall perspective, they do participate in the change control process. People under ITIL may be forming tabs or change advisory boards or configuration control board, where to go through and prioritize those new features, requirements, changes. They will conduct a risk analysis to ensure that it's worth the risk to put them in at a particular stage of the SDLC. And of course, they're going to go ahead and conduct estimations and planning to see if those changes will fit within the timelines or they need to extend the schedule. All that stuff happens in a traditional waterfall method. And again, in Agile, we do the same exact thing, only we do those part of the backlog grooming, which is right before, the backlog grooming is the prioritization of actual requirements. Sprint planning, before we go into a particular sprint, we're going to go ahead and look at any changes or prioritizations or risk analysis. And of course, when we do the release planning on when we're going to incrementally deliver the actual product, we go ahead and do this again. So again, from a role and responsibilities, to me, again, there is no change on a role and responsibility of an Agile tester. So both roles, both sets of responsibilities, whether we are in a waterfall or Agile development lifecycle. Progress review, yes, in traditional, we do have milestone reviews, whether we're tracking it on a project plan or some other method to ensure we are on track. In Agile, we check progress by the working software and releases. So from a traditional standpoint, we do those program management reviews. Again, many flavors of how we accomplish that. It gives us an opportunity to make course corrections and mitigations. We may take a risk-based approach at some particular time where we are prioritizing the requirements and critical operating issues and key process areas, which is all a part of the risk analysis we do before any of the projects that we take on. But again, from a waterfall or Agile perspective, the big differences here is Agile, we do this in a bi-weekly or every 2, 3, or 4 weeks, depending upon your sprint duration. However, from an Agile perspective, again, the prioritization is really based upon a few factors. One is minimal viable product. Really means what is the minimum amount of features that we could create and package so we could deploy to a production environment. Minimal marketable features. If we are building a product, what is the minimum features that can consist in that product before we can make it sellable? Or more commonplace now is earned business value, where typically if a change comes in or we're looking at milestones, the product owner or your business may come in and say they need this particular feature right now because it's going to give us $1 million. That's all about earned business value. What is the ROI based upon implementing this particular feature during that software development lifecycle? Progress reviews are also with Agile. Many tools are available where we track burn up and burn down charts, which is really a running total, either down or up, on if we have 100 requirements and we finish 50, well then obviously know we're 50% complete. Story points is a term that's really Agile specific. It's really the amount of effort based upon a relative measurement system. And again, requirements are associated with story points. Requirements or user stories are associated with story points. So story has, 10. Story has 10 story points, and when we finish 5 of those, obviously you know that you're halfway through. Velocity, again, another term for Agile. It's really the amount of productivity that comes out of your Scrum. So there is some progress reviews. We do it traditionally from a milestone. We've been looking at, in most particular instances, either a tool or a project plan to determine where we are against the plan. In Agile, this progress review, again, is real-time, on-demand if you're using a particular tool. But at the end of the sprint planning, sprint grooming, the sprint planning for each one of our sprints, we do an analysis at that particular time and a real-time display of progress of where we are against the baseline. So again, we do those same things again from a agile versus traditional. Quality responsibility, this is typical of a waterfall. Again, QA is really the final review of quality. As everyone knows, in the QA realm, if something breaks in production, the first thing we do is come to QA and ask, why don't we test this, or why didn't we test this? They're also responsible for change management. This is a huge responsibility to understand as things changes, they need to identify or validate that they are indeed testing the right build, the right versions of the build, that they deployed it through the various test environments, and what went into production is actually what they tested. And again, what the expectations are of the customer, as well as the program manager, and so on. Yes, there is detailed preparation upfront planning. However, in Agile, all that stuff is still done. It's done in Sprint 0. Heavyweight documentation, this really depends upon the rigor of the project. Obviously, if you are working on health systems or financial systems, and you are either governed local, state, federal, obviously more documentation is required. However, it's more content management or less rigor. The heavyweight documentation can be lightweight as well. So that's a lot of what Agile says about this documentation. Agile itself has working software over documentation as part of their manifesto. However, this does not mean no documentation. There is documentation required for Agile in the form of test plans and test strategies and everything that goes along with the waterfall. You will complete in 0. Entry and exit criteria at sign-off. Of course, this follows along with PMI as well. But again, we go from one particular test phase to another. Typically, we don't allow defect severity 1s or 2s to go forward. They need to be fixed. And that's strictly to control the backlog of defects going forward, as well as, does the software that we are either producing or pushing into production, does it and the end user effectively use that system? So entry and exit criteria is a huge thing within QA. As well as the last one, test automation is focused on regression, and that's pretty much true as well. Again, the reason behind that is because you don't want to automate too early, because the code base is going to change as we go through the system test cycle. However, we have the same type of responsibilities in Agile. Entry and exit criteria I can equate from a testing perspective with the definition of done. Definition of done is just criteria that is used to determine that a particular story point that does indeed meet the specifications, the features the user needs. It can cover many things, such as static code analysis and performance testing either. And again, demonstration is a huge part of Agile as well. It's a little bit different. After each 2-week sprint, we will go ahead and demonstrate what we've just built within that 2 weeks to the product owner, or in traditional would be a business, line of business analyst, or the PM, to show, yes, this is what we built, does it meet your expectations? And of course, they can either accept or reject the work product. So again, when you're looking at the criteria from a quality responsibility, typical roles or traditional roles of quality engineer still does these particular 6 bullet items. However, in Agile, the entire team is responsible for that. So Agile is part of their practices is that, everything is the entire team, everyone is responsible. There are no specific subgroups within the Scrum team. However, if you're a QA engineer assigned to that Scrum team, these are still your roles and responsibilities, whether you are 100% assigned to it or the team is responsible for it. The responsibility to get these particular 6 items done does not change between the traditional and Agile methodology.
Hey, Dave, real quick, a question came in while you're going over that. Do you create stories for the test team in each sprint? When the requirements for a feature are across several stories and possibly several sprints, where do you store the test cases?
Well, it really depends upon your tool. So when It depends upon the organization. However, DISYS itself, we use Quality Center. Quality Center is our test management tool. There are very, very few Agile tools out there that is a test case management tool. There are, the more popular ones are Jira version 1, Rally, those software, they manage Agile projects. Very few tools are at test management. So regardless of what my user stories are, all those test cases would go into Quality Center or Selenium if you're a TFS shop. That's independent of the Agile. But I will comment on, you typically don't want stories to go across multiple sprints. If that happens, you should try to decompose those stories down so each story can be completed within a single sprint. Some exceptions to that would be if you are creating the initial infrastructure to support subsequent coding that would go on multiple sprints. But it's not recommended that you're going to have a story that goes across multiple sprints. If that happens, you simply decompose that story down to a smaller work level or a smaller unit of a story and get it completed within that one sprint.
Thanks, Dave.
Yep. So to continue with this, again, this is taken out of, by the way, I'm certified off the Scrum Alliance. A lot of the stuff comes from Scrum Alliance. Agile testing is about applying the Agile values and principles to testing. And again, it relies on the effective communication between developers, testers, and the product owner. The BA writes the acceptance criteria and reviews it with the PO during backlog grooming. Again, that's where backlog is all of the requirements. So again, if you have a 100-page document that you can extract 100 requirements out of a waterfall project, you should have, again, this comparison, say 100 user stories that are on 3x5 index cards. The end result to me is the same. So product backlog is nothing more. When you say grooming it, that means they're putting it in the prioritization list based upon your high-value features first, or back to that earned business value. So the BA shares the acceptance criteria with the team during sprint planning with the testers and developers, and then testers write acceptance test cases. And in the end, the story is not done until testing is finished according to the DOD criteria. If I take these particular statements coming right out of the Scrum guide and substitute the words for a waterfall, you can see that all those three statements are still true no matter whether you are in an Agile or waterfall development. So instead of saying product owner, you can say line of business or business analyst. Yes, the BA writes the acceptance criteria, which is the expected result, and reviews it with the line of business to validate that what the BA writes from or the line of business writes, whoever does your requirement solicitation process, just so it's clear and concise. Yes, at one particular point in time during the cycle, it's going to be shared with developers and testers. Testers are going to go and look at those requirement documents and determine whether it's testable and measurable. And in the end, the story is not done until it meets the definition of done, which is the entry and exit criteria. So again, from the perspective of an Agile tester, you can equate the responsibilities are no different if you're following a waterfall or a Agile development methodology. Only the terminology has changed, and once you understand the terminology and the artifacts that go with it, a tester who is now part of a Scrum team or part of a waterfall team, their responsibilities do not change.
Dave,
so
real quick.
Yep.
Dave, real quick. You said you don't want to automate too early, but what if your approach is TDD?
That's different. That's an Agile process, and TDD is a development process, not a testing process. So TDD is a methodology or a practice that the developers use to create the test harness or test case first, which is going to fail, and then they go ahead and implement or create the code to make that test pass. So that, again, this is the perspective of a tester. He is doing unit testing on a particular feature. If you are a tester with a different viewpoint, critical thinking, he would not leverage those TDD test cases. He would still create his own. So TDD is a development practice to create code, not a testing practice that validates code against the user stories, requirements, specifications, the data permutations, everything that goes along with the testing function. And by the way, that first TDD, it's going to fail. So although there can be some opinions based upon that, just like saying since developers are doing unit testing, testers don't need to do a system test because developers already tested it. I see no distinctions between that and TDD.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
That's my opinion. In this particular thing, QA personnel are an integral part of the team and test activity start at Sprint Zero. This is a little bit different in some organizations. However, from a waterfall perspective, the trend has been in sort of many, many years now that QA should be involved from the very beginning at the requirements, capturing a requirement elicitation process. Try to enhance the requirement elicitation process instead of giving Word docs that is generated by a business analyst or a line of business and start sending emails out for review processes. It's much more efficient today to go ahead and do that as a group, leveraging either an integrated product team approach or a data approach, where as we are writing those requirements, testers, as they're part of that process, very easily ensure that before a work product is complete, that everything in that work product requirements are testable and measurable. So in Sprint Zero, as part of Agile, that is the goal of QA personnel, is really to ensure the user stories are testable and measurable, at least for the first sprint, and then of course they do that for each subsequent sprint during the sprint planning activity. So they do participate in the release and sprint planning activities, and this also includes estimation and planning. They're going to continue to collaborate with the development team and business analysts to define acceptance criteria, and this is clarifying expected results. This ensures that QA ensures user stories are testable and measurable, which is a standard function of QA. Provides continuous feedback to the team, whether they are tracking defects in the sprint or subsequent to sprint. They are still responsible for writing the test cases. They're still responsible for ensuring 100% test coverage, and of course they execute test cases. So all of these particular attributes of an Agile tester, again, are no different from a waterfall perspective than it is from an Agile perspective. So if we go back to the original summary there to understand how some distinctions between traditional and Agile, after going through this presentation, again, the roles and responsibilities of the QA test engine do not change whether using a waterfall or Agile development methodology. However, only the timing and method in performing and completing the test tasking differ in an Agile methodology. So before we go further, Brian, is there any more questions?
Nope, you're good to keep rolling.
So testing a lifecycle development or testing an Agile development lifecycle. So again, the reason why most companies go into an Agile methodology is these three factors. They minimize waste, that you can minimize code refactoring, product rework, that comes from code quality. Again, minimal marketable features. Instead of building 1,000 requirements, can we get away with the first 100? So if we're building a product that has, vast capabilities or feature capabilities, what can we put out into the market right now to start gaining some of our ROI? Second is increased productivity. And third is really speed to market, enhanced quality, and on-time delivery. Everything in Agile is based on commitment. If we say we're going to do something within 2 weeks, we're going to do it within 2 weeks. That's all part of the self-organizing, the self-management team to take on that integrity of estimation and planning, committing to delivering a particular requirement or user story, and then doing it within those 2 weeks. So speed to market, being able to create potentially shippable products every 2 weeks is that speed to market. And of course, if you're working within a sprint 2 weeks, the enhanced quality, again, I particularly employ a zero defect policy coming out of the sprint. There's no reason to have defects when we're only talking a 2-week time span. So the speed to market, enhanced quality, and on-time delivery is a huge business driver and why people would want to go to an agile methodology. So it gives us a bit more distinction testing and agile life cycle. The top box is really your typical waterfall. You get requirements in January, you design your February, March, April. You're going to code in April through August, and finally you're going to do the test, and then there's going to be a big bang at the end. So again, that's a lot of inherent challenges with that, especially with change control and requirements changing and dollars and schedule slippage. In Agile, we are looking for the incremental deliveries, again, high-value features, revenue generating, and that continuous feedback. So each month you can see we are delivering features and functionality that those companies can not only get it out into the marketplace quicker to realize that revenue or, again, the incremental delivery, but the end result is the same if we compare this from a year to a year. We're getting access to those things much, much earlier. And again, so that could be your speed to market. Again, increased quality because we are really focused on that 2-week duration to get things correct. And again, this is part of the big business driver on why people are moving towards Agile. This is particular a Agile framework, the one we use. Again, there's multiple phases in Agile. Inception, which is really aligned with your concept phase and your PMI. Sprint 0, all your pre-planning work. And then sprints can be 2, 3, or 4 weeks in duration, but never exceed 4 weeks. Now, the reason why I went over Agile, this high level, because these are the common themes. Organizations implementing or transforming to an Agile development do not realize expected or anticipated benefits. So the first issue we have, and even again from talking with our clients, that QA test engineers lack the necessary skills to leverage automation within the sprint. So when we assemble Scrum teams, to meet those every 2 weeks, Scrum is one of the principles is to automate. So when people do not have that necessary skill set, that means they're executing manually, which means they have a hard time of meeting that 2-week sprint duration. For each one of those particular user stories that come out, everyone knows a user story is a one, or a testing is a 1-to-many relationship. QA may be building all these test cases, but without having that capability to automate, they're not going to catch up. And this is where the sprints either get longer or QA starts getting a backlog of manual test cases, and pretty soon your release planning and sprint planning is all impacted, and people tend to blame Agile versus looking at the root cause analysis, is that the test engineers do not have the necessary skill set to leverage automation. If I want to go back to that statement very quickly. So from a DISYS perspective, how I do it, again, depending on the tool used to automate, whether you're a QTP shop, again, our test engineers are VB script developers. If you're a TFS shop, then our engineers are C# or C developers. Selenium, another popular tool out there, they need to be Java developers. It's much easier to train a developer from a QA engineer than try to take a manual QA engineer and try to teach them how to code. So it's coupling the technologies used with the necessary skill set, which would enable the QA engineers to automate, which is the next statement. QA engineers in an Agile Scrum need the tools, an automation framework, and a test environment so they can automate. So back to Sprint 0, in Agile, you do not want to proceed with development, nor should you do that in Waterfall to create all your code without creating necessary support mechanisms such as environment management or software configuration management. All that stuff is done in Sprint 0. So when we are in Sprint Zero, enabling the QA engineers to automate is very critical as well. So again, that gives them the tools, whether you're using, again, CPC, Selenium, CFS, JMeter, JUnit, whatever it is, the QA engineers need to have that at their disposal to enable them to automate. Secondly, they need to have the automation framework built and ready to go. You know, sprints are incremental, but more often than not, sprints build upon sprints to fix their roadmap and vision. For some particular time, that framework needs to consolidate and for consistency, predictability, you need that automation framework in place. And of course, you need a test environment to test. So again, this is typical waterfall. You need to have it segregated from your development environment. In my particular continuous integration solution, I also have performance environment. So having that test environment ready to go, so as the developers are checking in code daily, the QA engineers are able to automate, execute, and get that immediate feedback back to developers. And typically in a CI solution, it's less than an hour. So providing the necessary tools and framework and environment, even though you have developers, you still need to enable them to automate the necessary tools they need to do to automate. This next statement is probably the biggest theme amongst most people today. Test engineers are now always embedded within the team. So Agile is a team concept. Again, it's a cross-functional team that consists of all the skill sets that are needed to produce that particular product, user story, or release. So it does consist of your developers, your testers, your BAs. It could be an architect, a security. It can be all of them. They may not be dedicated 100% of the time at an enterprise level, but to get the true value out of Agile, you want to co-locate teams that facilitate that open communication and discussion around stories and designs and again, as a shared service or as a shared responsibility, people can interact. What's most common in the market, in the industry right now, is teams are either dispersed or distributed. What that means is if they're working off an existing backlog, which is all the requirements, distributed means that the developers are working here in the States, for instance, and their testers are offshore. That dispersed means that you have a Scrum team that is, you have a person here, a person there, a person working from home, and there's that whole collaborative, or one of the principles of this open communication and dialogue and discussion. It's simply harder to obtain and capitalize on that team dynamic. So again, a lot of that definitely has an impact on the quality engineers being able to have those discussions with the BA and developers and not be 10.5, 12.5 hours away. Second part of that is some organizations have an enterprise QA organization or a testing center of excellence. So the Scrum team, again, is not cohesive. That developers and BA may all be in a room developing code, and they simply pass it over to an enterprise QA organization that does the testing. Well, if you keep breaking that down, you're nothing more than a waterfall shop again that has implemented some of those Agile principles. Again, this is very common as well. To mitigate some of the automation skill sets, some organizations have a separate automation team. So they're okay with embedding a manual tester within Scrum and participate in sprints, but essentially they are in a manual capacity. Once that sprint is over, they simply take those test cases that may be in a tool, may not be in a tool, send it over to an enterprise or a separate automation team, and an automation team executes it. And lastly, there's really personnel constraints, that there's really not enough testers available within the organization to assign and dedicate to the Scrum team. So those are the four big areas. The most common, I say, you know, they all have their, they all can degrade the benefits and realizations of an Agile development methodology, but it's really dispersed and distributed models that seem to be more prevalent in the industry, where we have developers here in the States and testing done offshore, or vice versa. Lack of continuous integration solution, that also degrades continuous feedback mechanism. A lot of companies who say they're agile do not have this continuous integration solution. Continuous integration solution is really as developers check in their code to their source repositories, whether it's version or Git or whatever it may be, it automatically executes their unit test. Out of their unit test, there's other technologies out there called like Maven and Jenkins that'll go ahead and do the builds and do the version control. It'll run through some static code analysis to tell me how much of that code the developer just coded was actually tested, and it'll give me all these metrics and measures. And if it meets certain thresholds, for instance, in our solution, unless the code coming out of development exceeds 95% tested by a unit test, it gets kicked back and it doesn't go no further. But once it meets those particular thresholds, it then gets sent to my staging directory, where my functional testers will pick that build up and execute all of their automation tests. All of this stuff happens, and again, we try to limit it to less than an hour. So after every daily check-in, typically around 3 o'clock, by 4 o'clock, we know if that build works, we know if it passed the unit test, we know if it passed all the functional tests, and then you're set for the next day.
Hey, Dave, what's the ideal developer-tester ratio in this development model?
It would depend upon the product. Typically, when we assign teams, it's 4 developers to 2 testers. However, depending upon the size and scope and backlog, it could be 2 developers to 1 tester. The reason why we try to keep with 2 testers, there are some principles of pair programming, peer reviews, things like that. However, for infrastructures and hardware, I've seen it as low as, a Scrum team of 5 people that has 1 tester and 4 developers. It really all depends. But a typical Scrum team is going to have 4 developers, 2 testers, 1 BA, a Scrum Master, and around all of that we'll have the product owner and Agile Coach.
Dave.
So that concludes the role of an Agile tester. I think, again, being a career tester, sometimes it's confusing. When I talk to people, they want to know, what the difference is between an Agile tester and a waterfall tester. And really, there is no difference. Their roles and responsibilities are exactly the same. If they are going to produce, for instance, again, try to clarify, if we get a 100-page requirement document and we create 100 test cases, it does not matter if we do that by sprint and we're doing only 10 use cases, then we're going to create a requirement or a test plan that covers those 10. We're still creating the plans. We're still doing the same roles and functionality, but instead of doing it up front, we're doing it incrementally, that is aligned by the sprint. What that does is really increases the efficiency when it comes to, again, back to refactoring the code and managing change, reprioritization. You don't want to keep going back and recreating this master test plan. You're actually creating it right there and then, real time, and it really increases the efficiency of creating those artifacts. Same thing with prioritization and managing change. Again, if you keep reviewing them every 2 weeks during your sprint planning sessions, again, the QA can focus on the 10 or 12 features right then and there, instead of having to lump through a 100-page document or 1,000 test cases to find the associated ones. So, the method and timing in which we test differs in Agile, but the roles and responsibilities and what they're ultimately responsible for does not change from a goal, from a test perspective. I guess the biggest caveat of all this, and either when we are assigning Scrum teams or trying to help people become better at their Agile and maturing them through our coaching, it's really the necessary skill sets that go along with it. So it is making them understand that to leverage the benefits of Agile, is focused around test automation. And you simply, organizations tend to take their existing QA personnel, no matter where they're at, whether enterprise or just it's siloed by business, and they say, you're now part of a Scrum team. Well, unless they have that development capability, they're still not going to gain that particular realization of that continuous process feedback loop. From a transformation perspective, I do have one more slide here that I can show. These are the particular roles in a role transformation. You can see the product owner, which is the line of business, the Scrum Master, development team, test engineer, and business analyst. In Agile, there is no, you want to associate test engineer and business analyst with the development team, but the development team does not mean developers. It means a cross-functional team that includes all skill sets needed to develop the product. So when we're talking business analysts, test engineers, and development team, how do you transform these roles to meet those needs of those test engineers? So this is what we recommend and part of one of our strategies going forward. So, and again, bias towards quality assurance, and these test engineers, as part of their role, whether traditional Agile, really understands the system from an end-to-end perspective, where developers tend to code in silos, or they know this component, another one knows that component. Test engineers tie everything together. So to me, they have that knowledge, the broad knowledge of the entire system from end to end. Knowing that, they can transform into a business analyst, because a business analyst essentially does the same thing. He or she has that domain knowledge. They understand the business. They understand the application. So I usually recommend transforming a test engineer into a business analyst. The business analyst, by virtue of their domain expertise and product, can then become a product owner. The big role transformation here is capitalizing on the developer's capability to automate. And we transform those developers into test engineers. Again, it's easier, not easy, but easier to developer how to become a critical thinker and tester than it is to take a test engineer and provide them this tooling of a developer. The big key difference here is you do not change their job title. They are simply a developer working for QA. So again, you want to ensure, because a lot of developers will either think it's a downgrade in their skill sets, or they don't want to be associated with test engineers, but that's not the case. Developers remain developers in Agile, but they essentially are performing the testing function. So again, the role transformation, having the skills commensurate with the roles and responsibilities, again, is one of the key issues or factors that companies are looking to transform. Again, a lot of them think with Agile, with the managing, self-managing, self-optimization, all that stuff, that a lot of these particular roles go away. There's no need for them. That is not the case. Simply, the organizations need to understand with Agile, some of those roles and responsibilities need to transform better suit the Agile methodology. So we got 10 minutes, Brian. Any questions?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Really good job. There's a couple questions that have come in. Really quick, I want to address before you get started. I have a couple people requesting PowerPoints. What we're going to do, GoToWebinar sends out an automated email following the webinar. We're going to include a link that has the webinar recording on it. We will also have some contact information, so you can contact us directly and request a PowerPoint. So just make sure you email, when you get that email, just email us and I'll send it over to you promptly. So first question here, if a tester is working on an Agile team where TDD is being utilized by the dev team, is there benefit to the tester trying to leverage the scripts written by the dev team or TDD?
I would say we would obviously want to leverage as much as we could, but a tester's perspective is going to be much broader than a TDD tester. So although foundationally it may be used for the understanding of what the developer was trying to accomplish with his approach, it does not negate the fact that testers still need to create their own test scripts.
Okay. Next question. Can you comment on UAT time permitting? So you still have time.
So I'm not quite sure I understand that. So UAT and Agile, there's two approaches. One, if we're looking at a product owner, self-contained, once we do the demonstration after each product, he essentially approves that the software works as designed, that meets the expectation of his business. It does not take place of UAT that if we were going to deploy this to a company, for instance, they are obviously going to continue to do a UAT like a standard UAT. So to give you a perspective,
hey, Dave, he actually asked another question right afterwards. I didn't catch it.
Okay.
It said my previous question was regarding a feature overlapping several sprints. We learned things after sprint 1 that changed the design in sprint 2 and so forth. From your experience, what's the best use of QA so they aren't having excessive rework?
Well, that particular case, that is an anomaly that you do not try. That should be minimized at the very least. So in Sprint 0, you should have your architectural, your plan, your oversight, and whatever to minimize any code refactoring. There is no best. So from the sprint, if that's the direction we're taking, and then Sprint 2 comes, and you go ahead and change that approach, QA, being part of that embedded Scrum team, has to respond to the user stories that were reflected in the sprint. So there is no easy answer to this. They simply have to refactor the code along with the developers. Otherwise, you do not want to wait a few sprints before you start to automate and test. You have to do what's contained within that sprint. I would say the best use of your time is to ensure that your testers or automators are using reusable components, but you're not scripting from scratch each time. You're simply making the necessary changes within that reusable component that propagate down into all subsequent test cases. That becomes more efficient. Or you can try using keyword testing or something along those lines that minimize changes within your automation script. But you can't foresee what's going to happen sprint by sprint by sprint. What Agile says is do all that work up front and try to get as much of that architecture done and then build upon it. If you make changes in sprint 2 or you decide to change course directions in 2, there's not a lot of QA can do except roll with those changes. However, again, I think leveraging a useful component strategy would help mitigate some of the change control that you have to do to update those scripts. And sometimes it is easier to script from scratch than just try to modify any kind of code. So that's a tough one. Try to do the lessons learned by your sprint planning and retrospective, so you try to minimize that code refactoring.
Okay. From my experience, testers have been segregated from devs and BAs in Waterfall. When going into an agile environment, do you have any advice for mending those relationships?
It shouldn't be amending those relationships. They should understand that Agile becomes a team method. If there's distractions within the team, that's something, the Scrum Master or the coach or even whoever's, the PM, whatever, needs the team to understand it's a team effort. And there is no one person or one group or one subgroup within that Scrum team. Also, I can tell you now, and the industry is looking at how do you appraise or evaluate a Scrum team. Everything within Agile is based on the throughput or output of a particular sprint. If you fail to meet that sprint, or you don't meet the definition of done, or you're not getting your story points, in Agile, it's a shared responsibility, so either they all win or they all fail. So the thing now, especially from an HR component or HR perspective, is how do you rate a developer who thinks they've done his or her job, and yet the sprint didn't meet their requirements because testers couldn't finish on time. Well, the whole purpose of Agile is for that shared service. Developers should jump in and help test so they meet their commitment. So mending a relationship should not be at a personal level. It should be more at a higher level. They understand what Agile is, the purpose, the team dynamics, the shared responsibilities. That in itself should manage those relationships or mending those relationships. But team dynamics is huge in anything, and if there's one particular troublemaker within that team, you simply need to remove that person from the team. So, that's a tough one. Just by virtue of leveraging Agile should mend those, because everyone understands they're all responsible for the same outcome, and it's not tester does this, PA does this, developer does this. It's a team. They're looked upon as a team. They're output as a team, and now they're being appraised as a team.
Okay, last couple questions here. Can BDD have a more transformative effect on testing itself?
I see BDD, and I don't see much difference than the rest of it. So TDD, BDD, one's behavior-driven development, one's test-driven development. Only thing that would, if in my perspective, a user story or this test scenario or behavior-driven from a testing perspective is no different, because you still need to create the test cases to validate that behavior and behavior, again, back to acceptance criteria and the expected result. Behavior means it's going to behave a particular way. Well, you got to create test cases to ensure it behaves that way, as well as create test cases to ensure that if it doesn't, what is the impact, what is the exceptions, what are everything that goes along with it. So again, back to validating that the system works as designed, whether you're doing it from a TDD perspective, waterfall perspective, Agile, XP, or TDD, it all relates to, is it meeting the customer's needs?
Okay, and then along those lines, since BDD provides constructs for UAT, it seems it can be leveraged further.
It could, but it depends what if we go back into UAT. So again, let's separate it. So UAT is I build a product and I send it out to a bank, for instance. They're going to take that software package and they're going to execute their UAT. When we built it from a BDD perspective, same process took place. So that particular client is going to give us requirements. We're going to say, you know what, we can do this from a BDD. Let's sit down and go through all the behaviors. Let's go through the test scenarios, how you're going to use it. The UAT people, whoever performing that UAT, again, my recommendations, and I teach this going forward, do not re-execute anything from the development side. They simply go in there and they do their daily routine. They sit down and they say, oh, today's Friday, I'm going to execute this, 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 and this. How they do it is unscripted and should not be tied back to any BDD. It's, behaviors. It's, if the UAT person's sitting in there and they put in some data, they expect something to happen. So I'm not sure how they would leverage it. I encourage people not to leverage any of it, because when we create something software, we assume a lot of usability issues. We assume a person's going to use it this way. It's very scripted in structure. Even though BDD does allow for a little bit more flexibility, it does not take place of a UAT test case that they're going to execute their daily routine based upon their job, function, and role, and not the way we develop software. Opinion.
Last question that came in, again, on the topic of BDD. If the BDD cases were automated, then what will satisfy the definition of a test?
If the BDD was automated, what would satisfy the definition of the test?
Yep.
Well,
then will that satisfy the definition of the test? Sorry.
It would depend. I would say yes, but there's certainly some dependencies amongst that. So again, if they're going to automate it to include again, I'm assuming here, data permutations, negative test cases, positive, equivalence partitioning. Are they going to do boundary testing? Then absolutely. If they're doing it like a TDD, they're going to run through it and validate that the code works logically. And again, I'm just going from what I see. A developer is not going to run through for instance, a VA loan that has 5.5 million variations of data. Is BDD going to handle that? Is TDD going to handle that? Or is a tester going to go ahead and recreate a script and run it out to a database that's going to do a for next loop and run through there and test the mins, maxes, and equivalence partitioning? You know, it all depends upon how they structure that automated test within the DDD or TDD.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dave. That is all the questions we have, and we are just about out of time, so very well timed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Again, be on the lookout for an email with a follow-up with a recording of the presentation. Also, if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint, we can send it to you at that time. Just go ahead and reach out to us. We'll have instructions to reach out to the marketing department here at DISYS. So thanks again for joining us, and have a good rest of the week. And thanks, Dave.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Brian.